I have a letter from Bernie Sanders I want to get your reaction to. Let's put it up there on the screen. He says openly, quote, "It should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working class people should find that the working class has abandoned them. Will the big money interests and well-paid consultants who control the Democratic Party learn from any real lessons from this disastrous campaign?" You were a veteran of the Bernie Sanders campaign, David, and we've talked a lot about, I think, over the years about what went wrong also inside the Sanders campaign and really inside of like the Sanders movement itself to where it stands. But do you see any avenue and acceptance of this message amongst the Democratic Party today?
Here's what my fear is. First of all, I think Bernie's 100% right. I mean, he's not saying anything he hasn't said before, and he's exactly right, just as he has been. I think that the problem is, or the fear is that the consultant class of the Democratic Party, the operative class of the Democratic Party, and frankly, the pundits and the sort of affiliated Democratic media have an economic and financial incentive not to talk to the working class. In the sense that the political class of the Democratic Party is tied to the donor class, to the corporate class. And so what I fear, what Bernie Sanders is saying, which is correct, what I fear that it will be, how it will be interpreted is we have to move only culturally right. We have to go back to Bill Clinton, school uniforms, like the whole cultural triangulation, while continuing to push neoliberal economics. I mean, that was Bill Clinton's innovation, right? I mean, and I put that in quotes, but, move culturally to the right while pushing neoliberal economics, and that defines what so-called centrism is. Instead of what centrism was under the sort of the New Deal Democratic Party, which was speak to populist economics. And sometimes you'd have people in different parts of the country, elected officials, who were culturally somewhat different from Democrats' liberal orthodoxy. That has completely flipped. And I think the question is whether the consulting class, the people who make decisions about what the party's brand is, whether they're too essentially tied to the corporate class and the donor class that are at the center of the problem. I guess I'll put it in more briefly, which is to say, if you're trying to both speak to working class voters and appease and enrich and satisfy the donor class, you're going to either sound incoherent or you're only going to talk about a narrow set of issues that doesn't really tap into the real economic grievances of the working class because you're too busy trying to appease the donor class that's creating those economic problems.
So the pushback that I've gotten within my own household to my analysis, which is similar to yours, similar to Bernie's, that like y'all screwed up when you killed the Bernie Sanders, evolution in the cradle. Like when you spent the last 10 years as your primary political focus being to crush any semblance of a left populist class first movement, like that's where you really screwed up. And that's been ongoing for years and years. Now, the pushback I get is, okay, but look at the Biden administration, like great on antitrust, great on labor. Bernie Sanders was influential. Ron Klain, Bernie Sanders, you had the whole Build Back Better effort. They did do some stuff. Kamala ran on price gouging. She wasn't the focus of her paid media, like her earned media campaign, but the paid media was overwhelmingly sort of like class warish. And one of the things that I've used to rebut this notion is something I've been talking about for a while, that, while the antitrust and the labor stuff is really important sort of medium to long term, the real story of the Biden administration is the cutting of the social safety net that was erected under COVID. And there was a chart, we can put this up on the screen, guys, this Biden admin shifted from Build Back Better to austerity chart that shows, in the beginning parts of the administration, look at what all the fight was about. It was about a lot of the sort of Bernie Sanders-ish elements of, a social safety net embodied by Build Back Better. And then they shifted in 2022 to just talking about austerity, effectively, national debt, deficit, daily mentions. The other piece, though, I think is really critical, what you were naming, which is that it's one thing to have, as Kamala did, like a list of economic policies that are good, that are genuinely good, were genuinely popular, et cetera. It's another thing to have a story and a narrative about what has gone wrong in the country, who the villains are, who the heroes are, how we're going to fix it, et cetera. And to me, that's really the core of what they're missing. And what, Bernie Sanders was very authentic and compelling and credible in identifying.
Look, the Democratic Party does not like to name the villains because the Democratic Party is in a lot of ways
in bed with the villains.
I mean, there's a hesitancy to specifically name the villains because the villains are in the House, right?
Yeah, that's right.
They're afraid of that. I think your point about what the Biden administration did, I mean, there's two important points that relate to that, which is one, there's a somewhat unique situation in the sense that Joe Biden's cognitive decline made it much harder for Joe Biden to sell the policies that Joe Biden was doing, sellable policies about the economy. So I think, one thing that's important to remember is that 3/4 of the job of being president is not sitting in the Situation Room making decisions. It's actually selling your policies and telling a story about your policies. And the Democrats, the president was simply not able to do that. So I think it's not a great test case to say, oh, well, he put forward all he did these good things on the CFPB at the FTC Department of Labor, and the voters sort of rejected that. No, those policies basically weren't even sold. They weren't even pitched to the public as part of a story, really, of what the White House was doing. The second point, though, is when the American Rescue Plan passed, that's when Biden's poll numbers were the highest, when there was a creation of a real social safety net, a real investment in the working class. And guess what? Biden was popular. The problem is that then it expired and people got cut off. And so when people get something, realize like life can be a little bit better, that the government can actually do something, and then they wake up a year later and it's like, psych, we're just going to rip that away. Guess what? Lots of those people that might have swung over to you in the election, they're not going to be happy. And I think that it's not to say that that's the reason this election happened, but it is to say all of these things kind of pile up. You don't sell your agenda because of the situation in the White House. You've torn away benefits that people liked having and realized they could have, but the government isn't providing that to them. The party's not naming villains. The other guy is naming villains and is promising some kind of change. So guess what? Here we are.
Yeah. David, one thing I wanted to get your take on, I'm sure you'll love this. Can we put the Ezra Klein says that Bernie was right? Let's put this up there on the screen. There's been a lot of discussion here about Joe Rogan, by the way, which is very annoying because it's not about Rogan the man. Obviously, it's just about the sphere and
what that represents.
What that represents. Yeah. He says Rogan was symbolic of something bigger. There is an alienation that has grown between young men and much of the Democratic Party. For years, there has been no real way of talking about masculinity in liberal circles that didn't attach the word toxic before it. There has been a reveling in growing female strength and a deep critique of male culture. You can have any view you want on the merits, but it had its consequences. Whatever you think of Walz, he's a vice presidential pick, and that's not part of the ticket that people vote for. I'm just curious, you lived through a lot of these fights, and the Rogan one I remember quite well because it was a big schism, I think, online. I remember AOC coming out and denouncing Rogan after Bernie Sanders' appearance, when obviously the whole case for him going on was, look, I'm trying to win, I'm trying to reach as many people as possible. So what do you make of this now? The retrospective has proven, obviously, that's correct strategy.
Well, I had hoped after the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2020, I had hoped that we were going to win. We didn't.
Yeah.
I had hoped that Bernie Sanders would play a role and would become a figure analogous to Barry Goldwater in 1964, as Barry Goldwater was to the Republican Party. Not to say that Bernie Sanders is Barry Goldwater like on policy, but the story of the Republican Party is essentially Barry Goldwater was the intellectual anchor, the ideological anchor of the Republican Party, a sort of guiding light. And from there came acolytes who later were able to win office, Ronald Reagan, as an example. So I had hoped that that's what would happen after 2020, and it really didn't happen because the dynamics of the inside the Democratic Party are fundamentally different than the Republican Party. The Republican Party has become